Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're going back to 1966. We're going to be taking a look at Little Richard and he's going to be performing Tutti Frutti. So let's get Little Richard up on screen and see how he gets on.
She knows how to love me, yes indeed. Boy, you don't know what you do to me. Oh, really? To the fruit, 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 oh, really? Bop, bop, loo, bop, blah, blah. What you do to me, to the fruit, oh, to the fruit, oh, to the fruit, to the fruit, oh, wop, bop, a loo, mop, a lop, bam, bam.
And there we have it. What I love about this video and this performance is that the crowd are seated and they're getting into it about as much as you can do while seated. They're really going for it with dancing and moving around in the seats. But to put it in perspective, this is 1966 and Little Richard was one of those performers that brought everybody together because it's going back to a whole different time when he started out and the crowds were segregated, and at the top you had all the members who were black and all the members who were white on the bottom on the floor, and bringing together different people from different backgrounds and different colours is something that Little Richard did. But with these kind of performances, you just get into the performance and you forget about the time and how important he was in that movement of just bringing everybody together and making it acceptable and making it normal as it is. The other thing that he did was get the crowd involved in the performance between the songs by talking to them and making noises, getting the crowd to repeat those noises back to him, which we've got throughout this whole gig. But it just keeps everyone engaged because he is such an engaging performer when you watch him. This is the other thing about playing live and trying to engage a crowd. Little Richard played the instrument that is arguably one of the hardest instruments to play and engage a crowd, and that is the piano, which we can see from his mic setup. It is vertical, as if you're just standing singing as a standalone vocalist, but he's having to turn and play the piano at the same time. So bringing those two elements together is so difficult, and he wants to be all over the stage, but unfortunately, because of playing the piano and the fact that you can't move around with a piano, you certainly couldn't in 1966, it means that he is fixed to this mic, but somehow He gets that energy and everything that you want in a mobile performance, he puts into his performances. It's something that he used to do, put his leg up on the piano, he'd climb up on top of the piano sometimes as well. So he played an instrument that is so difficult to entertain whilst playing, but he managed it better than anybody else, and he made it his own. We also have a great horn section here as well, which adds so much to the sound, and it must have been great to have heard this live and hear that all come together. Little Richard is one of those artists that has all of the things that I mentioned in other videos that the top artists have, and those things are great songs, great technical ability, in this case, Little Richard's vocal cords and the ability to play the piano. It's something that was a given in the 50s and the 60s. You had to be able to accompany yourself on an instrument. But then the last thing, entertainment and putting on a show, this is the thing that was pushed to the limit with Little Richard because he did it like nobody else. Up until this point, before TV, it was all about radio, so you weren't really looking at anything whilst you were listening to the song or the artist, whereas when you started to see people on TV, the entertainment side really was a large part of it, and people that could put on a show, as well as being top technical players and singers, as well as having those great songs, they would then take the limelight, because when people went to see them at live shows, they knew what to expect, and they wanted to experience that live show and what they're seen on TV, but there in person. Getting into the vocal that he lays down and his vocal ability in general, because we can tell that between songs, the way that he's just going into that head voice, it's so easily done. You can tell that his range is connected the whole way. And that top part of his head voice, the top of his range, it doesn't sound airy, so it's not falsetto. He's getting a great connection with his vocal cords in that part of his voice. And it is so effortless. And this is the thing about great singers. Generally, they've been singing for years and years, and they started young. And this was the case with Little Richard, because he was singing in the choir, and that's where that gospel influence you can hear with his vocal delivery, the way that he ends his vocal phrases with those classic rhythm and blues lines at the end, which consist of 2 or 3 notes that are just thrown in there very quickly, but they're so accurate as well, which means that he has maintained that flexibility of his vocal cords in order to achieve this, not only with his head voice, but with that thicker tone of his chest voice. And when he leans into the sound and gets that rasp on there as well, he still maintains that flexibility. In the 50s and the 60s, it wasn't a sound that they'd heard before, going to a really aggressive vocal, and Little Richard had such rasp in his voice. It really stamped his authority on this new genre of rock and roll, and it's something that a lot of guys in the 60s with the British invasion would latch onto and hear this vocal distortion, this rasp in the voice, and they'd start to put that into their own sound. And all of the bands, even the Beatles, when they do covers of Little Richard's songs, you can hear the rasp that's in there. Interestingly enough, talking about the Beatles, Brian Epstein, when he knew that Little Richard was coming over to the UK to play a few shows, he got the Beatles on to support him, which was great for the Beatles because we're talking early 60s here, and it would have been an education, not only in putting on a show, but Little Richard would teach them how to sing his songs and how to perform them when they were then going to do covers of his songs. So certainly Paul McCartney took a lot from Little Richard with Long Tall Sally, and the ability to add that distortion to his voice. I'm not sure how much of it would have been directly from conversations with Little Richard, but you can hear the similarities in there, and just doing a cover of that song full stop is so difficult, but the Beatles did so well with Paul on that lead vocal. Talking about the gospel influences and him singing in the choir, he started singing at a very young age because his family were religious, so as soon as he was able to, he would get up there and sing. And there are stories of him being stopped in the choir because he was hollering and singing so loudly that it just didn't sit in with the rest of the choir. That's certainly something that he kept in his arsenal in terms of vocal techniques later on in his career. But being the third of 12 children as well, maybe he felt like he had to make his voice louder to be heard. The other thing about when he sang in the choir was that he was referred to as the one in the choir who was always changing the key upwards. So he was always wanting to sing higher and higher and higher. And you get the impression that he has no problem doing that because of his control and his vocal range. But then for other people in the choir, trying to stick with that, sometimes you don't want somebody changing the key where you physically can't sing it anymore. Singing loudly and projecting his voice is one of those things that led directly to his first mini break in the industry, because while he was at high school, he managed to get a job at his local auditorium selling Coca-Cola. And one night, Sister Rosetta Tharpe was performing, who was one of his heroes. And by the way, you can find a video on Sister Rosetta here somewhere on the channel. But he was singing one of her songs really loudly, and she just happened to overhear this. So she went up to him and offered him the opportunity to open up the show for her. So he got on before Sister Rosetta Tharpe and sang to the audience. And after this performance, Sister Rosetta paid him. So getting up on stage and performing and also getting paid for it inspired him to maybe pursue this as a career and try and get into music. And he started to learn to play the piano, and this was mainly due to the piano intro from Ike Turner's Rocket 88. The other problem that Little Richard had at this time was the fact that his family was so religious, and rhythm and blues was seen as devil's music. So he was getting into the kind of music that would make him frowned upon in the religious community, but he just really wanted to get into it. So as well as getting out there and playing himself, he would check out Roy Brown and Billy Wright, and he became friends with Billy. And this is a person who he learned a lot from in terms of his showmanship and his image. Bear in mind that we're talking about the late 40s, early 50s here, and Little Richard would perform in drag. It's something that definitely wasn't the norm around those times, but it just shows you that he didn't care about the image, and however he felt he wanted to look on stage during a performance, he would go for it. So having befriended Billy Wright, Little Richard took on a lot of what Billy did, even to the point of doing his hair the same way, having that similar image. And he performed on radio with Billy's band, and this is what led to Little Richard getting his first record deal with RCA Records, because they heard Little Richard on the radio, and he signed a deal with them in 1951. It was good to a point because the releases did well regionally, but the record label were looking to do well nationally, which unfortunately didn't happen. So that only lasted 1 year with RCA Records. In 1953, he signed with Peacock Records, but unfortunately he had a falling out with Don Robey, the owner of the record label, due to money, which is always the case with record labels and not getting paid enough. So anyway, it was to the point where they were in an actual fight and Little Richard got knocked out. He decided after that he didn't want any part of the music industry, so he went away and got a job as a dishwasher, and that's what he did to try and make ends meet. And in 1954 is when he set up The Upsetters, which was his band, and they did sign a tour contract with Little Johnny Taylor. So in 1955, Lloyd Price told Little Richard that he should send his demo to the record label that Lloyd was currently on, and that was Speciality Records. So Little Richard did this, and he did get a call back. And he was loaned the money by Speciality Records to pay off his previous contract with Peacock Records. So they got to work in the studio, and Little Richard was working with the producer, Robert Bumps Blackwell, and everything that they were working on just didn't have that interest, and there wasn't any spark there. So they decided to take a break, and they went to a club. And this is where Little Richard got up and he started performing a risque, dirty blues song that he knew called Tutti Frutti. And this is exactly what Robert was looking for in terms of the feel and the inspiration and the interest in the songs that they hadn't got down yet in the studio. It was the case that the version of the song that Little Richard was singing in the club wasn't really applicable to the music industry because it was very offensive. As I said, it was risque. So they changed the lyrics of the song to make it less offensive and recorded Tutti Frutti. When I say that he knew this song, Tutti Frutti, it was something that he'd made up himself. It isn't a cover of somebody else's song that was written previously. So they got in the studio, they recorded this, and it was released. It got to number 2 in the rhythm and blues chart, but it also got to number 21 in the mainstream charts. So it had that crossover appeal, and this was the huge break for Little Richard. It also got to number 29 in the UK. In 1956, he released Long Tall Sally, and that was another massive hit. It went to number 1 in the rhythm and blues chart. It got to number 13 in the mainstream charts, so that crossover appeal again, and it made it into the top 10 of the UK charts. This was also when the audiences at this time were segregated, whereas with Little Richard performances, people were starting to enjoy the performances together and dance together. And it was one of those things that hadn't been seen before, but people were enjoying the music as one, and it didn't matter what color your skin was. Moving forward into 1957, this is where Little Richard had parts in movies as well and released his first album, which was entitled Little Richard. In 1957, he was on tour in Australia, and this is when he started to get back to religion because he was on a plane and it sounded like they were having trouble with the engines, so he imagined angels were holding the wings in order to allow them to land safely. So he also saw a light in the sky, a bright red light, and he saw that as a message from God to change his ways and stop living the lifestyle that he was at that time. He was told after the fact that that was Sputnik 1, the satellite that was being launched into space, but he still saw that as a sign. At the time, he was visibly shaken from seeing this light. Also, he arrived in the USA 10 days earlier than he was scheduled to because he wanted to get back home earlier. And the flight that he would have been on 10 days later from Australia actually crashed. He saw that crash as a sign as well. So he decided in the early 60s to record and release more gospel-orientated material because of that change in direction. And in 1962 is when he was persuaded to tour Europe by Don Arden because he said that he was massively popular over there. But Little Richard thought that it was going to be a gospel tour, and he was touring with Sam Cooke. So what happened was Little Richard played the first show of the tour, and unfortunately Sam Cooke couldn't make it there. So Little Richard performed the gospel material, and he wasn't well received, and the crowd were booing because they were expecting the other material that Little Richard did and not this gospel material. So at the next gig, Sam Cooke played, and the crowd went crazy for him. And Little Richard then realized and was maybe a little bit jealous and got competitive about the amount of attention that Sam was getting with his performance. So the next time Little Richard came on stage, he went straight into Long Tall Sally and really pulled out all the stops. Little Richard was having such an impact in the UK playing live that he got his own TV special here in the UK as well. And in 1963, there was a tour that consisted of the Everly Brothers, Bo Diddley, the Rolling Stones, that wasn't doing very well. So they got in contact with Little Richard to join the tour in order to save it, to make more sales, to just break even with the tour and make a little bit of money. So that was the power that Little Richard had at that time, that he could just pull an audience wherever he played live. In 1964 is when Jimi Hendrix joined Little Richard's band as a full-time member. Unfortunately, that didn't last too long. Around this time as well, mid-60s, the British invasion happened in the USA. So unfortunately, it meant that Little Richard was in the background, and his performances in the USA USA tended to be smaller venues, but then when he was in the UK, he'd be playing at massive venues. It's interesting because a lot of bands and artists in the UK would have certainly been influenced by Little Richard, especially with live performance, and then they would go over to the USA and perform in that kind of way, and the USA really liked what they were seeing, but then because of the attention on those British bands, it meant guys like Little Richard didn't get the attention. In the late 60s, he changed his backing band to the Crown Jewels, and Larry Williams at this time got him booked into Las Vegas, played some shows there, and this was huge for Little Richard because people came out in their droves to watch him, and it didn't matter who else was on the bill, Little Richard always stole the show. So this led to TV, and Little Richard again was now a major celebrity. The early 70s was a great time for him. It started well, but unfortunately, after a few years and into the mid-70s, his drug and alcohol addiction took hold, and this meant by the end of that decade, he was then getting back to his faith, to which he actually released the 1979 album, God's Beautiful City. In 1984 is when he sued Specialty Records for $112 million due to the lack of royalties that he'd received from his recordings when they're released from that record label, and that was settled 2 years later out of court by Specialty Records. So it just goes to prove that that $112 million figure was probably accurate. In 1985, the biography by Charles White, also known as Dr. Rock, was released, and this brought Little Richard back into the spotlight, and it was a huge comeback for Little Richard. He appeared on TV and movies, and he also released a song called Great Gosh Almighty, which was a huge hit. And getting into the mid-90s, 1994, he opened WrestleMania, which is another huge event over in the USA. In the 90s, he did a lot of collaborations with other artists, ranging from Bon Jovi to Elton John. He's always toured. This is something about Little Richard. It is all about the live performances throughout his whole career, just putting on entertaining shows and top quality shows, to the point where in 2012, he was still performing in Las Vegas at age 79. It wasn't until the next year, 2013, that he announced his retirement from live performances. Obviously, I can't cover everything in detail that Little Richard has achieved in his career, but he's in the Songwriters Hall of Fame, he's in the Blues Hall of Fame, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, he's got a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame as well, and he's also got the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. But it's great to have a look back at a performance like this from 1966 of Little Richard in full flow, to show you exactly how engaging he is, even playing the piano at the same time, but getting the crowd involved. Like I said, it was all about live performance with Little Richard, because he gave you a show that nobody else could. But thank you guys so much for suggesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!